Hello and welcome to Journeys and Journals. I'm Bernie Martin Beck and I get to talk to the most interesting people around here. Sometimes it's a neighbor and sometimes a neighbor tells me about it, but this time my guest has come from a European recommendation. My friend Vivian in France said, "You've got to meet my friend Tom, who's living right there in Grants Pass." So, Tom, welcome to Journeys and Journals.
Thank you.
What brought you to Southern Oregon?
Well, I have a brother here, and when my wife died and eventually remarried, the woman I married had lived here on the Rogue River, and she wanted to come back here. So we came back. She developed Alzheimer's, and she's in Phoenix now. So we're not together, but she's in an Alzheimer's home.
She's not able to take care of herself at all?
No, not at
all. Tom, when I did the interview with you, I was just fascinated about your early years.
Yes.
So you grew up in Southern California?
No, I was born in Kearney, New Jersey, across from Manhattan Island, and one of my earliest memories, Dad had worked with Thomas Edison, the inventor.
Thomas Edison? You mean light bulbs and all like?
Light bulbs. And he said to my father, I wasn't trying to invent the light bulb. I was trying to invent the power and light industry. So when I was 8 years old, all our lights went out in the house, and we went out to the porch a little bit frightened and looked across at Manhattan, and everything was dark.
You mean New York turned off their lights?
Everything was off.
New Jersey turned off their lights?
New Jersey, Michigan, California. It happened all over America, you know.
And what was the reason?
Well, Edison had just died. We found that out when the lights went back on a few seconds later. Mr. Edison died, and he had indeed created the power and light industry. And along the way, created the General Electric, because the first name was Edison General Electric. There's Edison of New York, Edison of San Diego, Edison, Southern California Edison. So he went to the point of ambiguity. The thing that was missing, over in Germany, Siemens had invented the dynamo that made it possible to generate the current.
Power.
And over here, Nikola Tesla developed the coil that made it possible to distribute controlled current. So he went to the point of ambiguity. What was missing was a light bulb. That was his real intent, was to invent the power and light industry, which is what he did.
Oh my goodness. And you, your dad?
Worked for him for some time. And also he had worked for Charles E. Sorensen, who developed the assembly line. He told me how one day Mr. Sorensen attached a hemp rope to a chassis, a rubber-tired chassis of a Ford car, and pulled it through a factory to show Mr. Ford how there could be an assembly line.
And that's the origin of the assembly line?
That's the origin of the assembly line.
A rope?
A hemp rope tied to a rubber-tired chassis, no engine, no frame yet, just the...
So they'd pull it by the person who had the engine, and then the person who had the...
Well, eventually, that's what happened. They had a group of people visit Ford one day, and my father was working there with Sorensen at that time, and they had showed them a bare bones chassis, and 2 hours later, when they finished their tour, they found the same chassis now fully assembled.
In 2 hours?
In 2 hours, yeah. At the end of their visit, they saw the same car, because they had marked it up with chalk, so they knew. But now it was completed.
I was lucky enough to go through the Mercedes factory and the Studebaker factory, and so I can kind of get a picture, but there was a time before the assembly line.
Yeah. Well, Sorensen developed a prototype for mass production in developing a magneto line. And that was the precursor to the assembly. Then the next thing was to assemble the whole car.
Now, did you remember meeting these people?
No, I wasn't even born.
Oh.
At that time.
But you were born in 19 and
25. I wasn't there at the Gettysburg Address, but a few weeks later I was there.
well, you have one wonderful story about being a little kid in
New Hampshire.
and along came the parade.
Yeah, my dad had gone bankrupt. He'd built a building in 1929 and we had a Great Depression. By 33, he was bankrupt and lost the building, and we moved to New Hampshire. We had a home there that was in my mother's name, so the courts didn't take it away.
Because you'd lost your big house in New Jersey?
Yeah,
you'd lost everything?
He lost all of his investments, including the building that he built, and we moved to New Hampshire.
So you went from a rich kid, a very rich kid,
Well, we were well off, yes.
to bankrupt.
Yeah, there was a Jewish horse trader in our town by the name of Carl Lesnick that took my dad out on his horse trades. He had a nervous breakdown at that point, and he talked him back to mental health. So I've always had a deep affection for my Jewish friends.
Absolutely.
Yes. They're, I think, the world's greatest philanthropists. I've never understood persecution of the Jews. Never understood it.
Well, on that point, you and I are in agreement.
Yeah.
Tell me about when you were 8 years old.
Yeah.
This story, folks, has just fascinated me. I've thought of it since the day we first...
Well, it was our first year in New Hampshire, and Memorial Day, we had a parade, and we went downtown, and there were 3 Civil War veterans marching at the head of the parade, Army of the North, blue uniforms, and my dad held me up on his shoulders so I could see. He says, I want you to remember this.
So your dad had a sense of history.
Oh, yes. If you look at the early 1900s, it was a time of a lot of interesting history. My dad told me how he was on a ship. He was in the Navy, and they were going to run some tests on what he called wireless telegraphy, Marconi. And the men said, he's crazy, it's not going to come through the air. Marconi sent his signals, and they didn't, in fact, receive them on the ship.
And your father was there?
My father was there and witnessed that whole thing.
Well, now, electronics was kind of in your blood then, huh?
Well, yeah. It always was in my blood. I'd go around, my career went, Douglas Aircraft, and I was in preliminary design doing...
Excuse me, but did you ever build a... Well, this is a kid's toy from the 1920s.
Yeah,
Maybe
it's a nice, solid little airplane.
solid.
Yeah.
What's your airplane connection?
Well, I went to Douglas Aircraft after university, and I was a weight engineer. The weight of the plane, the balance is very, very important.
Right.
And so we had to estimate every part of the airplane from blueprints on the new transport. And so I was working.
Too heavy a tail and it's this way, and
Yeah.
too light it's that way.
Oh, yeah. But you make millions of calculations and every little part, and you know where it fits on the plane. In the end, you can guarantee the weight within 2% weight empty.
And this without a computer.
Well, we had computers, but it was very early in the day with computers.
You're talking 1950s,
early 50s, 1950.
And what does the plane look like?
Well, this was the DC-8, the jet. But during that time, I was asked to write a speech for Mr. Douglas, Donald Douglas, for the 50th anniversary of flight. He was being the man of the year for the contribution of the DC-3. The DC-3 ushered in modern air transport. It was the first one that did so. And so I was asked to write his talk for accepting this award. And I said to Mr. Raymond, Art Raymond, who was the chief engineer, what advice do you have? He says, I have no advice to give you. And so I then researched the history of how we happened to do that. And the history told me that American Airlines had come to Douglas and said all the immediate delivery positions of Boeing's new airplane had been taken up by American and by TWA, and they're eating our lunch. So we've got to have a new plane. We got to have it fast. So the DC-3 was designed in 4 months and rolled out another 5. The plane that changed aviation history took 9 months, and it was a living reality.
And you had your fingerprint on all of it. You were
I wasn't there, of course, at that time. I came to Douglas in the early 1950s, and
drawings and all manner of balance and weights and things. You had to know about that.
Oh yes, you couldn't do that kind of work if you didn't know about that. And but I got bored with the balance and weights because it was plain and solid geometry and the specific gravity of metals, and it was over and over again the same thing. I didn't understand what was happening in me, but something was happening in me. I wanted to handle more variables. So 2 of us teamed up, a theoretical aerodynamicist and myself. We found a friendly ear and the head of preliminary design, and we formed the first business planning unit for Douglas Aircraft. And our first major project, was the DC-8. Should it be a turbojet or a turboprop? What should it cost? How many seats should it have? And what would the cost per mile characteristic be? You know, all of those kind of questions. You couldn't do that work if you didn't have the background to do it.
Well, what is your background?
Well, I started in engineering school and then left engineering because I thought that the math was coming too hard. I thought to really be good at, I needed to be more of a mathematician. And so I switched and took a BS in management sciences. And then forever on, worked with engineers, led engineering groups.
So you had the best of both worlds.
Yeah, in a way.
In a way.
Yeah, what I am is a designer. I love to design things. I love to originate things, start new things. That's my...
Oh, folks, you can see why I like this guy a bunch. Because even this TV show was something that was one day in my mind and said, yeah, we can do that in Better Life television right here.
Yeah.
If Oprah can do her show talking to the most interesting people, I can do it right here.
You can.
And that's now 11 years ago. And
well, Mr. Kant never took the first step.
Kant never took
the first step. We can't do that. Yeah.
It wasn't invented here. Can't happen. Huh?
No, it can't happen. Well, you know, somebody wanted to close the patent office, who was running the patent office, made a suggestion to the president, I think it was in the 1860s, I'm not sure when. He said, everything's been invented that's worthwhile, so let's close it up. And fortunately, we didn't, because the greatest period was yet ahead of us. You know, the early 1900s were a period of tremendous innovation in our country.
And compared to that, the 1990s and the year 2000s,
yeah,
just there are more patents, including my own patent that's out there to be discussed, you know. I thought, well, I could do something. I've never seen it. Why not make it? So it's a portable sign that says recycle, and it can go on any garbage can. So instantly you would have a recycle sign. Nobody'd ever done it. But it was fun to think that I was thinking new thoughts and could go down to the top shop and have them make it up as a prototype. I found a real joy. For me, it's better than baking an original cookie dough or something but I'm sure other people find that to be And I couldn't possibly dream big dreams like you do.
I don't know if I dream big dreams, but the world of ideas has always been my thing. You know, I just love ideas, and my dad did too. You know, and I really started my planning career, world of ideas, at Douglas Aircraft when I was given a chance.
The world of ideas.
That's my world. I live in a world of ideas.
Tell me about your brother. He lives here.
My brother Don lives here about 3/4 of a mile from me. He was over today to see me.
And he knows you're on TV.
Yeah, I mentioned to him last night. He said, that's good.
What are some of the wonderful things that you've seen happen in your lifetime?
Well, we need heroes. I have some great heroes. Roosevelt and Churchill are great heroes of mine. I think they saved Western civilization. Roosevelt knew that we had to get involved in the European conflict. There wasn't going to be no stopping Hitler if we didn't. So he wrote a letter to Churchill when Churchill was First Lord of the Admiralty. He wasn't Prime Minister. And so he didn't write as President. He wrote as former naval person. I read that letter, and I've read about 1,100 letters that exchanged between them. You know, you learn a lot by doing that, you know. And he said, if you would like to apprise me of the situation that's unfolding in Europe, I would be pleased to enter into a dialogue with you. And Churchill promptly wrote back a long letter exactly dissecting what was going to happen. The war clouds were gathering, you know, we were going to be involved. So we had a stony-faced Congress back here. He told Churchill that Churchill would have to come over here and sell the American Congress himself. So he did. He came over and I saw the movie tone news. We didn't have television those days. And he got before some 540 combined houses, the Senate and the Congress, you know, the House of Representatives. And he opened with a little bit of humor. He said, if my father had been an American instead of my mother, I would be here today in my own right as a U.S. citizen. And there was a bit of applause, you know, for him, a scattering of applause, a few smiles. And then he said, I did not come here today to ask for money.
I can almost...
And they gave him a standing ovation. And when all the applause and everything was over, he said, for myself. He tricked them. He was the master of the applause. In comedy, it was Jack Benny. They knew they'd been tricked by a master Paul. And he got some old historians. Roosevelt started with what we call Lend-Lease. It was just a ruse to get us involved. And the day came a few months later when Churchill and Roosevelt were, Churchill and Harry Hopkins, the ailing confidant of Franklin Roosevelt, were standing on the dock at Liverpool in the fog, and out of the fog come these rusting, creaking old hulls, these destroyers. And Churchill, who had been the First Lord of the Admiralty, Roosevelt had been the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. They both know a good ship when they saw it. Well, Churchill was absolutely dismayed.
It was the best they had.
And he said under his breath, cheap and nasty. And then he turned around to Harry Hopkins, who was over here, and he sees the look on Hopkins' face, and he says, cheap for us and nasty for Hitler. He could recover very quickly.
You know, you were there, you saw all this developing. One of our cameramen today, his wife was in London at the time, and she tells stories of seeing the fires and seeing it. And had it not been for a helping hand across the Atlantic,
They would have gone.
and if they, so went the natives.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, this is telling me about your reading all these letters. What was the purpose of reading all this exchange of dialogue?
Well, I've always been very fascinated by how leaders lead. And those two people gave hope. Great leaders give hope, and they build great teams. And so I read the history. I go back in history. I study warfare, and back to 500 BC. I've studied warfare, and strategies.
Visiting the museum one time, I saw that they had every battle with little miniatures, so you could see how these things took place. I was fascinated. Your whole history and how you came into that particular thing, that's a whole another side of you. That's not the inventor, is
No.
it?
The inventor is a different side of me. That's the originator side. And my most productive period ever was at RCA. My daughter had died, and my dear gentle boss took me, Ted Smith, who had been the young engineer who developed all the receiving equipment, all the broadcasting equipment for the start of television. Sarnoff somehow knew, reached way down in the organization to do that. But Ted said, "It's a darn shame, Tom. Come back east with me." So I went back east with him. And had he raised his voice to me at any point, I would have shattered. I was very, very fragile. And Ted would disagree so gently that I'd have to ask him, "Are you disagreeing with me?" And he'd say, "Yes, I am." But he brought the very best. That was a period when I was telling your husband, we got the first camcorder, the lightweight 5.5 pound. That was RCA. I found the technology to make that possible at Stanford, got it licensed, SRI, and got it licensed. Almost lost it, the red tape in a corporation. And it almost went to somebody else.
Before a camcorder, what did they take movies with?
Well, they had movie cameras.
Great, big.
Yeah, and they had a 100-pound camcorder, which they carried on their shoulders. But that wasn't a consumer item. What we came out with was the 5.5-pound consumer item.
Now, do you have the patent on this?
Well, no, that was SRI. I licensed that technology and put our best camera designer on it at NBC. Well, I was at RCA at that time. And 18 months later, we had it out. We reached into our military and took our sniper scope capability. So it may still be the best low light level capability today, the RCA camcorder.
We've just gotten started with your history, but time's running out. I want to thank you so very much. This is fascinating. I feel like, like I was in that theater watching the newsreel with its funny sound. Didn't newsreels always sound like,
Yeah.
And you knew it was like being there. If you've got the time, I'd like to talk more with you about this, because you have, between your father and you have covered a century, right?
Yeah, I've lived about 25% of the life of our nation. I'm 83 in March.
Oh my.
It's been a long run.
Thank you so much for being my guest. And
thank you for inviting me.
it's a privilege. Flying airplanes, learning how to communicate better. Those are the things that I'm keen to know. Maybe after 30 years, I'll have this down. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Bernie Martin Beck, and I get to talk to the most fascinating people who are in our neighborhood, maybe right next door. Why don't you ask your neighbor his or her story?
There's a story in all of us.
There.